The Industrial Revolution may have started in Europe, but it grew up in America. And by the early 20th century, big steel, big oil, big auto, and even big aero, among others, all called America home. And it wasn't just size, it was technology and innovation. Americans could make stuff. But more than that, America pioneered the way to make stuff better and faster, which made America the world's factory. And that prowess meant America could not only build better products, but could build the armory that won the big war. And could build better cities and better neighborhoods, a better life, a better future. The industrial heartland, as it was called, even laid the foundation for America's success in the industries to come. Everything was great until it wasn't. Manufacturing employment rose and rose, then peaked, then fell, and then plummeted as factory after factory after factory closed. But of course, it wasn't mainly about statistics or factories, but about people and communities, which were absolutely devastated, hollowed out and broken like the factories and industries they relied on. In fact, some would say that the rise of other societal problems was way too coincidental to be a coincidence, further evidence of the social devastation wrought by this huge economic change. Yet, it seems it took most of us by surprise. There were early warning signs for sure, and you could argue we got distracted. Twice. But when you look at the economic trends during that time, one thing clearly stands out. Imports from China, which soared through the roof as Americans lost jobs. China had been through its own devastation, and its rise from the failure of communism and the societal collapse of the Cultural Revolution was remarkable. But is it possible that China's good fortune came at the cost of America's great misfortune? Does the rise of one manufacturing powerhouse necessarily lead to the destruction of another?
This is Dan Joseph of the Global Dashboard. Thanks for joining us for another installment of our series on the trade war. And we have videos and articles on a wide range of topics, including a whole bunch related to China, China's trade practices, the U.S. trade deficit with China, that sort of thing. Check those out if you can. This video is part one in a three-part series in which we focus exclusively on what is likely the most impactful aspect of the trade debate: manufacturing jobs. Did China steal jobs from the U.S.? Can the U.S. get those jobs back? We're going to address those questions. And I would guess, unless your job involves, analyzing economic data, you're going to hear a few things you haven't heard before, which might give you a new perspective. We start by looking at how the U.S. economy is evolving. If I told you that America has far fewer farmers than it used to have, I'm sure that wouldn't come as a surprise, although the details, like what percent of people are involved in farming, might not be familiar to you. Now let's broaden the view a bit and look at GDP for agriculture, industry, and services, the main sectors of the economy. See how industry and services are pretty close, the blue and gray lines, within 10% or so until the 1980s. Then services soars and leaves manufacturing in the dust. Now this is the same view, but for jobs, not GDP, and is even more compelling. Note how flat the line is for manufacturing from 1950 to 2000 and beyond. Even as the U.S. population almost doubled over those 50 years, the number of manufacturing jobs barely moved, while service jobs soared. Now let's look at the details. By 1950, service jobs were already almost twice as numerous as manufacturing jobs, 15 million to 28 million. Then this happened. Over the next 50 years, service jobs grew by 80 million, while manufacturing jobs increased only 2 million. That's a 40-to-1 advantage for service jobs, a huge transition away from manufacturing towards services. It's even more telling if we dig further into the details. From 1950 to 1980, service jobs increased by 40 million, while manufacturing increased by 4 million, a 10-to-1 advantage for services. Then, in the 2 decades from 1980 to 2000, while service jobs added another 40 million, manufacturing actually lost 2 million jobs, bringing the 50-year ratio to 40-to-1 in favor of services. So to recap, China joined the WTO in 2000, but for 50 years before that, from Elvis to Eminem, manufacturing jobs barely rose while services soared. And manufacturing peaked in 1979, 20 years before China became a serious factor. Whatever has happened to manufacturing jobs, it started a long time ago, long before the rise of China. Now let's broaden the view even further. This is employment per major sector as a percent of total employment for the U.S. since 1960. Now this is the same for the rest of the G7, the 7 largest advanced economies in the world. Notice how every country is trending the same way. Now here's a detail point worth mentioning. Germany and Japan follow the same trend as the US, but still have a higher percentage of industrial workers. Is that because those countries tend to have a trade surplus while the US has a trade deficit? Consider this. Since 1990, both Germany and Japan have actually lost more manufacturing jobs than the US, catching up to the US perhaps. On the other hand, while the US workforce has more than doubled since 1960, Germany and Japan are up only 30%. Those countries aren't better at keeping manufacturing jobs. They're just better at either birth control, border control, or both. Now let's look at specific industries. If you want to make the case that trade is causing lost jobs in the US, this is probably the best place to look. Apparel, clothing manufacturing. This is net imports and production of apparel in the US since 1990. You see how the green line imports is rising while the blue line production is falling? Clearly, imports are replacing domestic production. And both production and employment are down by 80% over the last 3 decades. The only conclusion that makes sense is that imports are replacing domestic production and causing job losses. It's that simple. And apparel isn't the only obvious case like this. Leather falls into the same category. But not all industries follow that pattern. This is paper manufacturing. Do you see how net imports for paper are actually quite low compared to production? For apparel, it was the green line above the blue line. It's the opposite for paper. Now, here are 4 industries that are similar. Either very small trade deficit, maybe 2% of production, or a trade surplus. So trade is not a big factor. How has employment been for these sectors over the last 30 years? Let's start with paper production, which in nominal terms is up 50% over the last 3 decades. Employment, down 44%. Printing, impacted even more than paper by digitization. Production is up a measly 3%. Employment, down 47%. Chemicals has been relatively strong. Production has more than doubled in 30 years. Employment, down 19% after production doubled. Finally, for a bit of good news, food. Production is up, more than doubled, a healthy 125%. Employment's also up, but only 8%. 8% over 30 years after production doubles. Not much reason for optimism relative to factory hiring. 2 other industries to mention quickly, just because they're frankly quite important. The first is steel. This is production of steel since 1960. Not in dollars, but tons of steel, which completely eliminates any impact of trade or economics at all. This is steel jobs down 85% since 1960. So basically, we can make 90% of the steel with only 15% of the people, a 600% increase in productivity. No trade impact, all technology. And now lastly, oil production. One of the bright spots of the US economy over the last decade. Over just the last 5 years, oil production is up a huge 85%. Yet oil field employment is actually down 2%. 85% increase in oil production, and we can't get one oil field job. Economists crunching the numbers behind all industries have concluded that 80 to 80% of manufacturing job losses are due to technology and productivity, not trade. Now, there are some other economists who use different methods to account for things like price factors, who say the number is more like 60%, lower, but still a solid majority for technology versus trade. Beyond the models, I would put it this way. Manufacturing employment and output as a percent of the total in the US peaked at least 70 years ago. Total manufacturing jobs were mostly flat for decades and peaked 40 years ago. The trend applies across all advanced economies, even those with trade surpluses, and applies to most industries as well. Even among sectors that are booming, almost no one is hiring. Considering this long-term, broad trend, spanning decades, countries, and industries, is it really possible that higher tariffs and renegotiated trade agreements will reverse the course of manufacturing? Really? I'd say there's reason to be skeptical. Raising costs might simply accelerate automation, and if you do get jobs in one sector, they'll probably come at the expense of jobs in another sector. That's how it usually works. Considering where we are now, I guess we'll have to wait and see. Time will tell.